Hello there, and welcome to the Middle Ages, a time when sneezing without saying, "God bless you," might get you accused of harboring demons. In this series, we'll take a meandering stroll through the strange, spooky, and occasionally ridiculous world of medieval superstitions. Settle in, light a candle, ideally one that won't summon anything, and let's get started. Superstitions of daily life. The rooster crows. It's early morning in a small medieval village, and despite what you've heard, that rooster isn't just announcing the day. No, it's signaling your survival, because if a rooster crows before midnight, the devil is apparently prowling around. It's not a charming rise and shine sound you hear at 4 a.m., it's a frantic warning. The rooster's crow is a divine alarm system. So while you're rubbing your sleepy eyes, remember that somewhere the devil might be lurking, and it's the rooster's job to get rid of him. Of course, that's assuming the rooster is on time. If it misses its mark, you're stuck with an entire day of dark omens, and it's only breakfast time. Let's hope that rooster is punctual. Inside the cottage the fire crackles, and with every snap and pop, the villagers know something important is about to happen. They're not just trying to heat their hands or cook dinner. No, the hearth has a much more noble purpose: keeping the spirits out. It's not enough to have a warm meal. You need the right fire, the right herbs, and the right signs to make sure nothing nasty follows you in from the woods. A misplaced log could let in a demon or, worse, an unwanted ghost. The fire must be tended carefully at all times. If you walk away for even a moment, you could turn your humble hearth into a portal for anything from mischievous fairies to spirits with unresolved business. You might wonder then if the whole village is living in constant fear of some spiritual disaster. The truth is they are. It's a wonder they manage to get anything done. As you step out of bed, you're immediately faced with a dilemma. Which foot to put on the ground first? It sounds trivial, but this decision could dictate your entire day. You know how the old saying goes, "Step with the left, and you'll be cursed until the evening." Okay, maybe it's not that catchy, but it certainly carries weight. If you step with the left foot, that's bad luck. The right foot? That's the safe bet, the good foot, the one that ensures you'll make it through the morning without tripping over something important. After all, a stumble out of bed could lead to a stumble into your destiny. And destiny at this time usually means an unfortunate encounter with a rat or a missing piece of bread. But it's not just about which foot to start with. As you shuffle into the kitchen, there's always the possibility that you'll spill something. It could be water, oil, or, heaven forbid, salt. Spilling salt is basically the medieval equivalent of a catastrophic event. It's a symbol of bad luck, a sign that something has gone terribly wrong, and likely something will continue to go wrong for the rest of the day. Maybe your bread will burn. Maybe you'll forget your keys. The possibilities are endless. But fear not. There's a simple cure. Throw a pinch of the salt over your left shoulder, not the right one. That would be absurd. No, it's the left shoulder, because that's where the devil hangs out, looking for mischief. Throwing the salt over your left shoulder is the quickest way to blind him temporarily and ideally get back to breakfast without any further mishaps. You might think you could just get away with wiping it up and pretending it didn't happen. But let's face it, a little salt spill is an omen that demands action. Ignore it at your peril. Breakfast itself is a minefield of superstitions, especially if you have a dog. If your dog is sleeping on the wrong side of the door, you're probably in for a rough day. It's not that the dog is particularly uncooperative, it's just that its location is a sign. The wrong side of the door. That means you'll likely meet an unfortunate end later. And don't even think about letting the dog eat first. That's just begging for bad luck to follow you like a shadow. So, your dog waits while you figure out how not to spill the porridge. Meanwhile, you're also trying to avoid staring into the reflection of your own face, because, well, mirrors were more than just reflective surfaces back then. They were portals, and a broken one was nothing short of disastrous. Speaking of mirrors, don't even think about breaking one. A broken mirror was said to bring 7 years of bad luck, a superstition that persisted for centuries. But it's not just about bad luck. The real kicker is that breaking a mirror meant your soul was at risk. The cracks in the glass symbolized cracks in your very soul, and once shattered, there was a real fear that your spirit could be sucked into the shards, never to be seen again. So if you happen to knock over the mirror while brushing your hair, be sure to pick up the pieces carefully. You might be able to salvage a bit of luck, but more than likely, you'll just be out 7 years of misfortune. Now, let's talk about the curious case of the black cat. We all know that black cats crossing your path are the epitome of bad luck. But in the medieval world, this wasn't just superstition. If a black cat crossed your path, you could be facing a day filled with misfortune. It wasn't just the cat itself that was the problem. It was the connection to witches and the supernatural. Cats, especially black ones, were thought to be witches' familiars. So you're not just unlucky for the day, you might be under the thrall of a witch's spell, which could lead to any number of disasters, from illness to a sudden inexplicable desire to start wearing pointy hats. But let's not focus solely on animals. The furniture too has its quirks. A piece of furniture left slightly askew, that's a sign of an impending argument, or worse, bad weather. Don't ignore it. It's a small task, really. Just straighten that chair, adjust the table, and you're good to go. It's the little things that will get you after all. A crooked chair might be the least of your worries when the weather decides to throw a tantrum, but it's still important. And heaven forbid you sit down before straightening that chair. You might be inviting discord into your life. The chair will not forgive you. And then there's the curious case of breaking bread. If you break your bread and it cracks down the middle, there's no escaping it. You're in for an unpleasant day. Why? Well, bread is sacred, and a cracked loaf indicates that your day will be similarly cracked, full of problems, broken relationships, and misfortune. So before you eat, be sure to inspect the loaf thoroughly. If it's cracked, don't eat it. In fact, don't even look at it. Throw it out, burn it, bury it in the garden. Whatever it takes to keep bad luck at bay. The witches again. At this point in time, witches weren't just hanging around in forests, stirring cauldrons. They were everywhere. Your neighbor, the lady at the market, even the woman who makes your bread. If she has a special herb mixture, or knows a few too many tricks for soothing your stomach pain, she might be a witch, and if she's a witch, you might be in for a spell or two. To avoid falling prey to her dark magic, it was best to never ever ask for a favor. After all, the kindness of witches often comes with a price. No, thank you. You'll take your sourdough without the side of hex, thank you very much. But let's not forget one of the most dangerous superstitions, the witch's mark. It could be a birthmark, a mole, or just an oddly shaped freckle. But if you had one, you were at risk. People believed that witches bore marks, and the presence of such marks meant you could be accused of witchcraft. So, if you were unlucky enough to have one, you had to be careful. Cover it up, avoid pointing it out, and pray that no one noticed. Otherwise, you'd be spending the next few months under scrutiny, and maybe even in the stocks. And while you're out and about, be cautious of the sun. It's a symbol of good fortune when it shines on you, but should the sun be clouded over, or worse, should a cloud cast a shadow over your path, it could be a harbinger of doom. Take extra care not to walk under the shadow of a tree at that time, as that's said to bring the wrath of the unseen forces directly to you. A shadow might not seem like much, but in the Middle Ages, a shadow was a serious matter. Every sound, every shadow, and every object had the potential to disrupt your life. Or, if you played your cards right, could protect you from the unseen forces lurking in the world. All it took was a pinch of salt, a quick prayer, and maybe a few garlic cloves. So the next time you trip over nothing or spill a bit of wine, remember, you're probably cursed, and there's not much to do about it except hope for a rooster to save you. Signs, omens, and portents. If you've ever had a particularly bad day and thought to yourself, "This is just the universe messing with me," you might have been on to something. In the Middle Ages, people didn't just blame bad days on bad luck or their own mistakes. No, they had signs and omens to justify that things were about to go completely, catastrophically wrong, or at the very least, slightly uncomfortable for the next several days. For example, imagine you're walking along the road to your village, feeling pretty confident when you notice something. A black raven. It's sitting there on a fence post, staring at you. If you thought it was just a bird, then congratulations, you are not medieval. If you were living in the Middle Ages, that raven was a sign, not of your unfortunate timing to be walking in front of a fence post, but a sign of your imminent doom. The raven, with its dark feathers and unsettling stare, was often viewed as a harbinger of death. The fact that it was perched directly in front of you, an individual in your prime, only meant one thing. You were about to take a long, possibly very untimely nap. But don't worry, the next sign could be a little more optimistic. Let's say you're sitting in the village square, minding your own business, when you notice the sky growing dark. A storm is coming. But wait, there's a flash of light. No, it's not a stray bolt of lightning from the heavens. It's a comet. A comet? That's no ordinary weather event. The comet is a celestial sign, And in the medieval mind, that meant big things were in the works. It could be a sign of an impending change of leadership, or the birth of a new ruler, or it could be the start of a terrible plague. You could never quite tell. After all, comets are tricky things. They didn't show up to announce good news, like a new bakery in the village or the arrival of fresh apples. Instead, they often signaled something much darker, like, well, death or war. So if you saw one, best start looking for a good hiding spot. Or at the very least, prepare to live without fresh fruit for a while. And let's not forget the very real and terrifying possibility of a supernatural encounter with the natural world. Take the owl, for example. Unlike the raven, which was simply a bird of doom, the owl was a bird of mystery and impending doom. When an owl hooted at night, it was not serenading you with an impromptu tune. No, it was announcing the approach of something sinister. Hearing an owl hoot from a tree near your cottage could mean that a death was on the horizon. And in a world where death was just another part of the daily routine, it was nice to have a warning, even if it was a little inconvenient. The owl didn't just symbolize the death of your village's eldest member. It could be the death of you. That's right. You've just been walking along, humming your favorite folk song, when bam! The owl tells you it's time to go. Now let's turn to the celestial phenomena. You're sitting at your window one evening, and you notice something strange. A full moon rises in the sky. It's big, it's bold, and it's suspiciously red. Oh no, it's a blood moon, a sign that something truly disastrous is about to occur. For most medieval people, this moon wasn't just an inconvenient lunar event. It was a signal of war, famine, or even the birth of a tyrant. When the moon changed color, it was the kind of thing that made you lock your doors, gather your family, and maybe start baking some extra bread in case you needed to ride out an impending apocalypse. After all, if the moon was out to get you, what chance did a humble cottage have? But it wasn't just animals and celestial bodies that could spell trouble. Even a seemingly innocent number could send shivers down your spine. Take the number 13. Of course, we all know 13 is considered unlucky today, but in the Middle Ages it was practically a death sentence. The number 12 was the perfect divine number, the number of apostles, months, hours in a day, you name it. But 13, it was an affront to nature. A meal with 13 people at the table was seen as a sign that one of you was about to die, and not in a peaceful old age kind of way either. No, one of you was probably about to get the axe. If you found yourself in a situation with 13 people, you might want to discreetly slip out of the room before things took a dark turn. Either that, or you could just sit tight, hold your breath, and hope your seat at the table wasn't the one closest to the door. The number 3, on the other hand, was considered rather divine, which is why it was the ideal number of times you needed to knock on wood. This brings us to one of the more common signs you'll encounter in medieval life. If you ever found yourself in a situation where you needed to make a wish or avoid an ill fate, it was customary to knock on wood 3 times. The idea was that wood, especially oak, was sacred. It was home to spirits, and knocking on it was your way of requesting their protection, or at least ensuring you wouldn't trip over a log and fall into a river. But if you knocked on wood 4 times, well, that's where things got interesting. And by interesting, I mean disastrous. The 4th knock, that was the point at which you started to tempt fate, and fate in the medieval world was never one to be tempted lightly. So remember, 3 knocks, no more, no less, unless you wanted to be struck down by the forces that were watching your every move. But let's say none of these omens have come your way. Maybe you're just having a peaceful afternoon, sipping on some water or a nice non-toxic beverage. Well, if you see a spider crawling across the wall, that's not necessarily a good thing. In fact, it could be the worst thing possible. Spiders in the Middle Ages were thought to be possessed by demons. A spider on your wall wasn't just a pest, it was a direct threat to your safety, and possibly to your soul. If you didn't kill it immediately, you were running the risk of inviting evil spirits into your home. Naturally, that meant there was only one thing to do: kill the spider, clean up the mess, and probably burn the house down just to be safe. But not everything that came your way had to be dreadful. If you were lucky enough to witness a rainbow, you could find a moment of peace, for the rainbow was often seen as a sign of hope, a promise from the heavens that all would be well. However, rainbows had their own quirky rules. It was said that if you saw a rainbow in the morning, it meant the day would be calm and prosperous. If you saw one in the evening, however, it foretold a future filled with misfortune. So, if you saw a rainbow as the sun set, it might be time to cancel your plans, hunker down, and prepare for the worst. Of course, there was one sign that trumped all others in medieval superstition: the simple act of sneezing. You see, in a time before modern medicine and science, a sneeze was more than just an involuntary bodily function. It was a possible signal from the gods, and depending on how you sneezed, it could be a good or bad omen. A single sneeze might be a sign of a change in fortune, a good omen. But if you sneezed twice, you were in for trouble. It could signal that someone close to you was about to pass away, or it could even indicate that you were about to be cursed. So, the next time you sneeze, try to be careful. It could mean the difference between a healthy day and one full of bad luck. Then there were the more unusual omens, like the case of the rooster. Everyone knows that a rooster crows at the break of dawn, heralding the start of the day. But what if that rooster crowed at night? What if you heard it crowing when you knew for a fact the sun wasn't rising any time soon? In medieval times, this was a harbinger of disaster. A nocturnal crowing rooster was a sign that the dead had come back or that a dark force was at work. So if you heard that crow at night, you might want to grab your garlic and start praying. After all, the rooster didn't just crow for fun. Similarly, there were rules about the weather and nature's behavior. A foggy day could mean that danger was on the horizon. In the countryside, when the fog rolled in thick, it was said to be the work of spirits, confusing the path ahead, making it easier for evil forces to lurk unnoticed. The next time you see fog, just know that the medieval world would have had you clutching your amulets and praying for guidance. And if none of that was ominous enough for your taste, consider this. If you dropped bread on the floor and it landed butter side down, or lard side down more accurately, some believed it was a message from beyond, not just a sign that your day would be awful, but that your soul might be too. After all, why else would God allow such cruelty? Clearly, fate had it out for you. So next time your food hits the floor, don't just curse your clumsiness. Prepare for an exorcism. Have you ever heard of medieval malice? There was a time when if your cow stopped producing milk or your hairline started receding, it wasn't your diet or genetics to blame. It was Steve from 2 huts down, giving you the stink eye while you watered your turnips. Welcome to the world of curses, hexes, and the evil eye, the medieval trifecta of paranoia. Curses were considered a kind of spiritual landmine, invisible but explosive. You couldn't see them, touch them, or smell them, but they could ruin your crops, rot your teeth, and turn your perfectly innocent goat into a possessed maniac with a grudge. Unlike modern-day complaints which are passive-aggressively posted online, medieval curses were mumbled under breath, whispered in Latin, or hurled across a muddy street with genuine venom. Hexes? Similar deal, but with bonus craft supplies. Hexes often came with tokens or objects charged with intent. Think voodoo doll, but less effective and more straw-based. And the evil eye? That was just someone looking at you wrong. Literally. No lasers, no chanting. Just a glance that could supposedly kill your plants, cause miscarriages, or give your horse diarrhea. Powerful stuff. Everyday curses, the passive-aggressive magic of the Middle Ages. In the absence of Yelp reviews or civil lawsuits, curses were the preferred method of customer feedback. Didn't like how your neighbor's dog barked all night? Curse it. Think the baker overcharged you for moldy bread? Curse his oven to never rise again. Feel like your husband's been spending too much time at the tavern? Curse the beer. Or him. Or both. These weren't grand Hollywood-style hexes with green smoke and lightning bolts. No, these were curses sewn into clothing, muttered over meals, or baked directly into pies. Sometimes quite literally. A disgruntled cook might inscribe Latin phrases into the crust of a meat pie meant for an enemy. Imagine biting into your dinner and swallowing a sentence of doom along with undercooked venison. People believed that even everyday objects could carry curses. Buttons, locks of hair, or even shoe buckles might be cursed if handled by the wrong person. And don't even get started on mirrors. If someone cursed your mirror, not only did you get 7 years of bad luck, but now every time you looked at yourself, you risked absorbing ill fortune through your reflection. Narcissism wasn't just dangerous. It was spiritually lethal. To a medieval mind, a curse could come from anywhere. The wind, a sneeze, a weird look. This made daily life a delightful scavenger hunt for danger. You were basically just trying to make it through the day without someone whispering doom onto your soup. The evil eye. The original side eye of doom. The evil eye was not a Harry Potter spell, though it probably deserved its own wand motion. It was a superstition that believed someone, usually old, socially awkward, or simply unattractive, could curse you just by looking at you too intensely. This wasn't a special ability handed out at birth. It wasn't taught in schools, which, to be fair, most people didn't attend anyway. The evil eye could be involuntary. That's right. Some poor soul could be cursing people without even knowing it. Which made for a truly nerve-wracking trip to the village market. Children were especially vulnerable. Babies were practically evil eye magnets, mostly because they were cute, and people said things like, "What a beautiful child," which paradoxically was seen as tempting fate. Compliments were basically spiritual bear traps. The solution? Spit on the child. Not a metaphor. Actual spit. You'd give a baby a compliment, then hock a tiny bit of phlegm onto their forehead to counterbalance the praise. Parenting was glamorous. Animals weren't spared either. A jealous glance at someone's plump sheep or abundant chicken coop might condemn the animals to illness or infertility. And crops? If you caught someone staring at your barley too long, you had every right to panic, sprint across your field, and confront them with the sweaty, breathless accusation. In short, the evil eye was just another reason not to make eye contact. A tradition that has somehow persisted in awkward elevators and crowded buses to this day. Protective measures against the evil eye. Luckily, medieval folks didn't just sit back and let themselves be cursed into oblivion. They had methods, scientifically unfounded but enthusiastically employed. The most popular counter-curse? Spit. Again. Not even kidding. A strategic glob of saliva was believed to break spells, avert glances, and offend everyone within a 5-foot radius. Garlic also made the list, of course, because if there's one thing guaranteed to ward off both vampires and judgmental neighbors, it's aggressive halitosis. People hung garlic over doors, wore cloves around their necks, or even carried a clove in their pockets, just in case they bumped into a particularly malevolent monk. Iron was another favorite. A rusty horseshoe over the door was more than just rustic decor. It was medieval Home Depot sorcery. Iron was thought to disrupt magical forces, possibly because it was heavy and unpleasant to chew. There were also talismans, bones, herbs, bits of metal, and occasionally saints' teeth. Yes, actual teeth, carried in pouches or worn on belts. If that didn't work, you could always try drawing protective symbols around your house, preferably while muttering prayers, Latin phrases, or just vague threats at passing clouds. Some households even painted eyes on their walls to confuse the evil eye, because apparently staring back at it with a cartoon mural was just the thing to cancel out the cosmic damage. Professional cursers and village hexers. Of course, some people made a living, or at least a suspicious income, by claiming to control these dark arts. They were the cunning folk, village witches, or wise women, depending on whether they helped cure your warts or hex your brother-in-law. Need someone's cow to stop giving milk? Need a wart to fall off? Need a charm to keep your spouse faithful, or just quieter? There was a person for that. And yes, business was booming, at least until the local priest caught wind and decided that curing headaches with owl feathers was definitely Satan adjacent. These practitioners walked a fine line. Too helpful, and they were saints. Too accurate, and they were witches. One misplaced charm, one healing gone wrong, and suddenly your friendly village herbalist was being dunked in a river to see if she floats. They often spoke in riddles, handed out suspiciously damp scrolls, and charged you with chickens, eggs, or slightly stale loaves of bread. And in fairness, they probably knew more about medicine than your average barber, who might solve a toothache by bleeding you with a leech and a prayer. Legal consequences of cursing. Cursing someone in the Middle Ages was not just poor etiquette, it was potentially illegal. And not in the quaint tisk tisk sense, but in the burned at the stake sense. The church, the crown, and the guy who lived next to you and didn't like your cooking all had opinions on your habit of muttering Latin backwards at your enemies. Accusations of cursing could land you in ecclesiastical court. This was less Judge Judy and more judged by clergy who believe demons live in soup pots. The legal burden of proof was incredibly flexible. Did someone's cow die after you looked at it funny? Evidence. Was there a dead bird near your front door? Clearly a harbinger of dark intentions. Did you own a black cat? Congratulations, you're now a sorcerer. If convicted, punishments ranged from public penance to excommunication to, for the overachievers, execution. Sometimes, if you were really lucky, they'd just force you to walk through the village wearing a humiliating hat and ringing a bell to announce your cursedness. The medieval justice system, where shame met symbolism. On the plus side, if you could argue that your curse was a prayer, you might get away with it. May God smite my neighbor's wheat was technically a plea for divine intervention, not a threat. Loopholes, the true magic of the legal system. Famous cursing cases and scandals. Some curses were so dramatic, so legendary, that they found their way into history books, or at least scandalous parchment notes passed between monasteries. Take the infamous curse of the Abbey of Hexham. In the 13th century, a particularly vengeful monk allegedly cursed a rival with eternal warts, crooked teeth, and unseasonal mildew. The target wasn't amused, but the abbey's cabbage harvest mysteriously failed. So, who's to say? Then there was the cursed tapestry of Glastonshire, which depicted a local noblewoman with 7 children, all smiling. Shortly after it was completed, all 7 reportedly fell ill with melancholy bowels. A medical term will let you Google. The tapestry was burned, the artist was exiled, and smiling in tapestries was quietly discouraged. In another case, a man in Devonshire sued his neighbor for hexing his pig into misbehavior. The pig apparently began walking in circles and squealing Gregorian chants. The court, not wanting to delve too deep into pig theology, ordered the animal to be exorcised, which did absolutely nothing but amuse the local teenagers. And let's not forget the woman accused of cursing an entire wedding party after she wasn't invited. 10 guests got food poisoning, the cake collapsed, and the groom developed an unfortunate rash. Coincidence? Possibly. But she did mutter, "May your joy be half-baked," and people took that sort of thing very seriously. Church versus curse. The medieval church didn't like competition, and curses were exactly that. Unauthorized spiritual influence. So they launched a full-scale moral PR campaign. Curses were demonic, hexes were heretical, and the evil eye was basically witchcraft with squinting. Priests were trained to detect signs of curses. If someone sneezed 3 times without blessing themselves, that was a red flag. If your crops failed and you hadn't tithed properly, clearly God was outsourcing punishment to your neighbor. The church offered cures, of course, for a small donation. Holy water was the first line of defense. Sprinkle it on your livestock, your home, your spouse, whatever seemed most cursed. If that didn't work, Latin prayers shouted by someone in a cassock usually did the trick, or at least gave the impression of doing so. Smoke, bells, relics, and shouting in candlelight were also popular. Again, not always effective, but certainly dramatic. The church often tried to absorb folk practices. If villagers wore charms, the church made its own, usually containing splinters from saints' bones or hair that was probably holy. The goal wasn't to eliminate superstition, but to franchise it under divine management. So if your neighbor cursed your onions and you told your priest, you'd be armed with holy water, a suspiciously tooth-shaped pendant, and an extremely judgmental sermon to toss back at your foes. Everyday fear and folk belief. For the average peasant, curses were part of the daily routine, somewhere between milking the goat and wondering what the rats were planning. Most people didn't walk around in constant terror, but they did take precautions. Superstition was just good sense. Entering a new house, knock 3 times, leaving on a journey, turn around and spit, find a hair in your bread, burn it while chanting. No one knew if it worked, but not doing it felt like asking for trouble. There were dozens of everyday rituals. Hang herbs above the door, never sweep after dark, don't lend needles to pregnant women, and for the love of Saint Mildred, don't whistle inside. Everyone had a cousin who did, and ended up with gout and bees. Children were swaddled in red to repel curses. Travelers wore bells on their shoes, and if you felt a curse coming on, say, you stubbed your toe and a crow cawed ominously, you might quickly mutter a counter-curse, just in case. Something like, "I bite my thumb at thee, dark spirits," which also conveniently annoyed any nearby ghosts. It wasn't about being paranoid, it was about being prepared. Like carrying an umbrella in case of rain. Except the rain might be a hex delivered by a neighbor with excellent aim and a grudge about your hedges. So what have we learned from this light-hearted plunge into medieval supernatural warfare? Mainly, never underestimate the power of a dirty look, and don't compliment babies without following up with a spit. The Middle Ages were a minefield of invisible threats, and curses were the glitter of the supernatural world. Annoying, hard to remove, and suspiciously everywhere. People were imaginative, resourceful, and wildly dramatic. Whether they believed in curses to explain misfortune, to justify revenge, or just to feel a sense of control in a world filled with plague and mud, curses served a social and deeply entertaining function. Healing, herbs, and magic. In the Middle Ages, medicine was what happened when prayer didn't work and your local holy man was busy battling a demonic pig. Healing wasn't about science so much as vibes, intuition, and whatever plants hadn't been eaten by goats. If it smelled terrible, burned a little, or was slightly poisonous, chances were good it had medicinal value. The average medieval first aid kit consisted of a handful of pungent herbs, a rusty knife, 3 inconsistent saints, and the assumption that God was probably annoyed with you. But don't worry, there was also wine, which doubled as an antiseptic, anesthetic, and emotional support beverage. Every village had at least one healer. She, almost always a she, was part herbologist, part gossip, part midwife, and part unofficial therapist. She knew what herb made you vomit, what herb made your enemy vomit, and what herb made you see angels reciting recipes. These women learned by experience, oral tradition, and the time-honored method of accidentally poisoning someone and then dialing it back a bit. They treated everything from headaches to heartbreak, often with the same tea. If that didn't work, they added honey. Despite being lifesavers, healers had the unfortunate tendency of being accused of witchcraft if the weather turned bad or someone sneezed too loudly. It was a fine line between blessed herbalist and defiler of chickens. Healing others was noble. Healing too well was suspicious. If you could grow it, you could grind it into a paste and slap it on a boil. That was the herbalist's creed. Medieval Europe was a botanical free-for-all. Plants weren't just plants. They were signs from God, conveniently labeled in Latin for maximum confusion. Yarrow, used to stop bleeding and start sneezing, may also repel boring guests. Wormwood, excellent for stomach issues, liver troubles, and warding off your in-laws. Mandrake, looked like a person, screamed when uprooted, and probably traumatized generations of gardeners. Valerian, a sleep aid that smelled like unwashed socks. Effective, but unpleasantly pungent. Garlic, the medieval version of duct tape. It was used for colds, infections, vampires, and seasoning anything too healthy. Herbs were usually administered as teas, poultices, or terrifyingly chunky broths. No one knew how or why they worked, but if you shouted prayers while stirring, it counted as a treatment. The medieval mind was a masterclass in extrapolation. The doctrine of signatures declared that God had marked each plant with a visual clue about its use. If a root looked like a lung, it must be good for your lungs. If it resembled a spleen, great news for your spleen. This meant walnuts were good for brains, they're brain-shaped. Beans helped the kidneys, kidney-shaped. And carrots, well, they were orange, which was clearly significant in ways never fully explained. It was spiritual deduction with botanical overconfidence. This philosophy was both ingenious and wildly misguided. It produced some hits, foxglove for heart issues, and some dramatic misses, buttercup for eye infections, don't try this at home. Still, it provided an easy system for villagers who were functionally illiterate but spiritually curious. It also made for very confident weeding. Healing potions in the Middle Ages were just cocktails with an alibi. They involved herbs, roots, crushed gems if you were rich, and bits of animals if you weren't. Recipes were passed down through generations, usually along with the phrase, "Don't drink too much or you'll see ghosts." One popular remedy was a concoction of wine, sage, honey, and something bitter enough to make you regret being sick. This was taken thrice daily, unless it gave you diarrhea, in which case it was considered spiritually cleansing. Elixirs were often kept in small bottles with labels like tonic for courage or the good stuff. These weren't regulated, nothing was, and dosage was measured in gulps or however much fit in the wooden spoon. Side effects included drowsiness, visions, and accidentally confessing to your neighbor's goat theft. Sometimes herbs weren't enough. Enter healing rituals, a blend of spiritual optimism and desperate theater. These involved candles, chanting, symbolic gestures, and occasionally a well-timed scream. Popular rituals included laying on of hands, best performed by someone who had bathed recently. Circle chanting, stand in a circle, chant something vaguely Latin, hope the patient doesn't notice you're improvising. Anointing with oil, usually olive oil, sometimes goose fat if times were tough. Crosses on the body, traced with fingers, sticks, or anything pointy and nearby. If nothing worked, people assumed it was a test from God, or the sick person had made some very poor life choices. Either way, it was out of the healer's hands and into divine customer service. Medical astrology was all the rage. Your spleen wasn't just acting up, it was under the influence of Saturn. Medieval healers used star charts to determine when to bleed you, when to give you mint tea, and when to just give up and let fate handle it. The moon was particularly influential. It governed tides, moods, and apparently your lower back pain. A full moon was good for making salves, bad for making decisions. A new moon meant it was time to harvest herbs or blame your neighbor's goat again. Every organ had a zodiac sign. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on. This led to excellent excuses. I can't dig your ditch today. Mars is in Virgo, and my pancreas is sulking. Doctors, the real kind with robes and egos, carried astrological calendars and looked very smug while using them. Results were mixed, but confidence was high. Saints were the customer service representatives of medieval healthcare. If your herbal salve didn't work, you prayed to the appropriate saint, lit a candle, and maybe built a tiny shrine out of desperation. St. Sebastian, for plagues, arrows, and general martyrdom. St. Apollonia, toothaches and screaming. St. Roch, skin diseases and questionable leg wounds. And Dymphna, mental health and awkward family issues. If your prayers worked, it was a miracle. If they didn't, you probably needed a better saint or a larger candle. Some particularly devout folks went on pilgrimages to healing shrines, which combined the joy of walking 300 miles with the reward of bathing in muddy water, touched by a relic. Eventually, someone had to deal with the physical bits: broken bones, boils, arrows lodged in sensitive areas. This was the surgeon's domain, or, more accurately, the barber's. Yes, barbers were also surgeons. They'd cut your hair, lance your abscess, and let your blood all in the same visit. The red and white barber pole? That's a reference to bloody bandages. Fun! Common procedures included bloodletting, for everything from fevers to bad dreams. Still unclear why this was popular. Tooth pulling. No anesthetic, but you did get a free scream. Amputations, done quickly, with a saw and a prayer. Usually performed outside so the mess didn't linger. Sterilization was a foreign concept, and surgical tools were cleaned with spit and hope. But occasionally, people did survive, usually by accident. Healing wasn't complete without the right words and trinkets. Magic words weren't so much spells as aggressively hopeful phrases shouted at wounds. Abracadabra wasn't a party trick. It was written on amulets to ward off disease. People carried charms made from bones, teeth, bits of cloth, and anything that sparkled vaguely. The more worn out the charm looked, the more people trusted it. A fresh, clean charm clearly hadn't been tested against enough evil. Healing prayers often included long strings of names, divine or made up, as if overloading the heavens with syllables would speed up service. It was all very elaborate, very sincere, and very unlikely to survive peer review. But it made people feel better. And honestly, that's half the battle when your options are goat spit and guesswork. Animals were important, which meant they needed healing too. Veterinary medicine in the Middle Ages was mostly yelling, praying, and rubbing herbs on the wrong part. Cows were dosed with beer and garlic. Horses were treated with molasses, iron filings, and a stern talking to. Chickens were, well, mostly ignored unless they stopped laying eggs, in which case a minor exorcism might be performed. Farmers often used the same treatments on animals as on people, which was convenient but occasionally problematic, especially when it came to enemas. If a cow got better, the healer was a genius. If it died, the cow was obviously cursed. Either way, someone brought more beer. Medieval healing was chaotic, charming, and occasionally effective. It combined plants, prayers, planets, and potions into a grand, muddled dance of hope. It was trial and error with a side of superstition. And yet, people kept trying. Because even if your poultice smelled like despair, it was better than doing nothing. Today, we have antibiotics, clean hospitals, and doctors who don't consult goat livers. But the desire to find meaning in illness, to believe that a bit of string or sage can fix what ails us. That's eternal. So next time you light a candle for good health or drink tea for your headache, remember, you're participating in a proud, slightly unhinged tradition of medieval healing. Just skip the bloodletting. Of course, no discussion of medieval healing would be complete without mentioning the curious role of urine. That's right, urine was the medieval version of a diagnostic scan. A skilled uromancer, yes, that was a thing, could hold a flask of your finest yellow and determine everything from your mood to your marital prospects. Color, clarity, and even taste, for the brave, were all part of the analysis. A deep golden hue might indicate a healthy liver, or just that you hadn't drunk water since last Tuesday. Cloudiness was bad. Froth was suspicious. And blood? Well, that meant your week was about to get very interesting. Then there were healing relics, bits of bone, cloth, or vaguely person-shaped wood said to belong to saints. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles just to touch a toe knuckle of Saint Euphemia or a splinter of the true cross, of which there were apparently enough to build a respectable fence. These relics were housed in elaborate shrines and guarded by monks with suspiciously well-fed appearances. The faithful believed one touch could cure gout, madness, or a tendency to sing off-key during Vespers. Whether the healing was real or the result of several days of walking and spiritual peer pressure is unclear. But either way, no one came home empty-handed. They usually brought back a new blister and a firm belief that their soul was slightly shinier. Birth, marriage, and death. The holy trinity of the medieval life cycle. Being born, getting hitched, and eventually kicking the bucket. These three events were the main social landmarks in a world that didn't have Instagram milestones or retirement parties. Instead, your entire existence was a tightly choreographed dance around superstition, ceremony, and a strong smell of incense. In the Middle Ages, birth was less a joyous miracle and more a high-stakes gamble where the odds weren't exactly in your favor. Picture a scene, a smoky, dimly lit room filled with nervous relatives, a midwife with questionable credentials, and herbs burning in the corner because someone read in a manuscript that rosemary could keep demons at bay. If the baby cried upon arrival, great. Maybe it would live past its third birthday. If it didn't, well, time to call in the priest and discuss emergency baptism. Midwives weren't just glorified baby catchers. They were spiritual defenders, herbalists, and amateur exorcists. The belief was that labor attracted malevolent spirits, as if childbirth weren't challenging enough. So the midwife's job included whispering prayers, tying holy relics to the mother's arm, and yelling at shadows just in case. A child born with a caul, a thin membrane over the face, was considered lucky, possibly destined for greatness, or at the very least not guaranteed to be cursed. These bits of birth membrane were actually dried and sold as protective charms for sailors. Because nothing says safe voyage like a fragment of someone else's placenta. If the child was born on a feast day, that could be a sign of divine favor. If born during a solar eclipse, That was less ideal. Medieval folks loved astrology almost as much as they feared left-handed people. Planetary alignment during birth was thought to determine your entire destiny, although no one could explain why some people born under a lucky star still ended up shoveling manure. After surviving infancy and not getting drafted into monastery life, a person might one day marry. But unlike today's romantic notions of love and compatibility, medieval marriage was primarily about land, alliances, and making sure your sheep didn't go to your cousin. Marriage arrangements often began in childhood. By the time a girl was 12 and a boy 14, they could legally marry. Nothing quite says eternal love like contracts negotiated before puberty. These arrangements were more like medieval real estate deals, with fathers shaking hands and the bride staring at the floor, praying her husband didn't already have the plague. Weddings themselves were as much about public spectacle as they were about vows. Church ceremonies were required for legitimacy, but plenty of couples exchanged vows at the front gate, or even in bed, with witnesses. The church wasn't thrilled about impromptu horizontal betrothals, but tolerated it as long as someone paid for a priest eventually. Superstition ran rampant during marriage ceremonies. Wearing green was considered unlucky, possibly because it was the color of fairies, and fairies were known homewreckers. June weddings were favored, thanks to the goddess Juno, who allegedly supported marital bliss, or at least didn't actively sabotage it. Brides carried bouquets not just for beauty, but to mask the stench of a bathless fortnight. These bouquets were stuffed with fragrant herbs like garlic and dill, which were believed to repel evil spirits, jealous exes, and poor hygiene. The wedding feast was the real celebration. Food, drink, and dancing ensued, and occasionally a bedding ceremony, where the couple was escorted to the marital bed by a crowd of singing and uncomfortably observant relatives. Privacy wasn't exactly a top medieval value. Death, in the Middle Ages, was a team sport. People didn't just quietly expire. They staged their exits like minor celebrities. The ritual was as important as the death itself. Dying well, ars moriendi, or the art of dying, was a whole genre of literature. It offered tips like repenting loudly, naming your sins, and not glaring at the priest. A good death required preparation. Confession, communion, and final prayers were ideal. Dying suddenly was considered deeply inconvenient, both spiritually and for those who needed to divvy up your stuff. The moment of death was surrounded by omens. If a candle blew out, the soul might have been snatched by the devil. If a dog howled, it meant someone nearby was going to die. If multiple dogs howled, it meant there was a sale on coffins. Funeral processions were grand, even for peasants. Bodies were wrapped in shrouds, sometimes sprinkled with holy water or herbs. Wealthier folks got coffins, everyone else got a blanket and gravity. Bells rang out to ward off spirits, and mourners walked behind, weeping appropriately, or performing, depending on their relationship to the deceased and whether they were in the will. Superstitions governed everything from the direction of burial, east-facing to rise at Judgment Day, to the behavior of crows, bad, and cats, us. The dead were often buried with tokens, coins for the ferryman, saint medallions, or their favorite spoon, just in case there was soup in the afterlife. People believed the soul lingered near the body for several days. This is why watches were held at night, candles burned non-stop, and why Aunt Maud refused to let anyone sneeze near Grandpa until he was 6 feet under. Graveyards themselves were full of charm. Literally. Crosses, herbs, and even rusty nails were planted to keep the spirits content. If a grave started to sink prematurely, it was assumed the soul hadn't made it to heaven yet. Or the gravedigger was just really bad at his job. All 3 of these life stages were glued together with 1,000 little beliefs. Pregnant women were told to avoid strong emotions, lest the baby be born moody. Newlyweds slept with knives under the bed to ward off evil. The dying were warned not to look at mirrors, lest their soul get trapped inside and forced to watch future generations use hair gel. If you sneezed during labor, it meant the baby would be cheeky. If a black cat crossed the wedding procession, someone was going to get divorced or develop gout. And if it rained at your funeral, it meant the angels were crying, or possibly that someone forgot to bribe the weather saint. Even anniversaries of births and deaths were loaded with ritual. Lighting candles on the anniversary of a loved one's death helped guide their soul in the afterlife. Forgetting to do so might result in that soul coming back to knock over your favorite goblet. Children were taught early that life was full of unseen dangers. Death could come from illness, sin, or an improperly placed shoe. Birth was sacred, but precarious. Marriage was celebrated, but closely monitored for any signs of demonic meddling. The medieval world was like living in a never-ending episode of Supernatural, only with worse lighting and more livestock. Yet despite all the rules, rituals, and really awkward marriage arrangements, medieval people somehow navigated the terrifying journey of life with a mix of hope, humor, and just enough superstition to make things interesting. Which, let's be honest, is not entirely different from modern times. So next time you complain about wedding seating charts or baby showers, remember, at least no one's trying to divine your future based on the liver of a goat. Probably. In the end, medieval life was less a straight line and more a chaotic loop of rituals, omens, and community theater-level dramatics. But these milestone events, birth, marriage, and death, offered the illusion of order in an otherwise very plague-prone world. They marked time, gave people purpose, and kept the neighborhood gossip mills well fed. And if all else failed, if your childbirth was cursed, your marriage involved someone else's cousin, or your funeral got rained out, you could always blame the fairies, or Mercury being in retrograde, or, if you were really desperate, the neighbor's goat. Poor thing never saw it coming. Witches, demons, and night terrors. Ah, yes, the medieval trifecta of nighttime anxiety. Witches, demons, and the kind of sleep paralysis that makes you wish you hadn't eaten that questionable turnip stew before bed. If you've ever woken up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat and wondered if the shadow in the corner was your bathrobe or a hellspawn sent to whisper Latin curses into your ear, congratulations, you'd have fit right in during the Middle Ages. Let's start with witches. To the medieval mind, a witch wasn't just your eccentric neighbor who collected herbs and talked to her chickens, though that was a red flag. No, witches were perceived as the ultimate party crashers of Christendom. They were blamed for everything from crop failures to erectile dysfunction. Couldn't explain why your cow dropped dead? Must be a witch. Milk went sour overnight? Witch. Tripped over your own feet? Obviously the work of a malevolent hag with a grudge against your lineage. The logic was airtight. Now, the church didn't initially take witchcraft all that seriously. Early on, they considered belief in witches to be foolish superstition. Then the 15th century happened, and suddenly everyone was very sure that witches were not only real, but holding weekly meetups with Satan, complete with snacks and orgies. This theological U-turn gave us delightful reads like the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a guidebook that basically said, here's how to find witches, torture them until they confess, and then kill them, preferably with fire. It was like a medieval self-help manual if your goal was mass paranoia. The checklist for identifying a witch included such obvious giveaways as having a mole, being unmarried past 30, owning a cat, or, heaven forbid, being literate. Possessing knowledge of healing herbs was also suspect. Apparently, curing someone's rash with chamomile was just the gateway drug to full-blown necromancy. Let's not forget the infamous ducking stool. If accused of being a witch, a woman might be tied to a chair and dunked in water. If she floated, she was guilty, because witches repel baptismal water. If she sank and drowned, well, oops. At least she died innocent. Justice was a choose-your-own inevitable doom kind of system. Then there were demons. Unlike witches, who might still be your neighbor unless she had an unusually high wart count, demons were seen as infernal agents of chaos. Hell's interns, if you will. They existed to tempt, torment, and terrify humans. Every bad dream, every temptation, every stubbed toe was likely the work of a lesser demon with too much free time. Medieval theologians spent a shocking amount of time cataloging demons. It was like Pokémon, but significantly less fun. Each demon had specialties. Some tempted men into lust, others whispered lies, and some simply loitered in your pantry to spoil your lentils. There were rankings, too, your Beelzebubs, your Asmodeuses, your everyday tempters named Dave. No one was safe. To guard against these creatures, people filled their homes with religious iconography. Crosses, relics, holy water, and the occasional tooth of a saint were popular decor choices. Prayers were said before sleep to ward off night demons, because nothing disrupts REM sleep like a whispering succubus crouched on your chest. Which brings us neatly to night terrors. Sleep wasn't the blissful escape we imagine today. For the medieval mind, sleep was a vulnerable state where your soul might wander, or worse, something else might wander in. Nightmares weren't just bad dreams. They were often interpreted as real attacks by demonic entities. This is where we get the charming concept of the incubus and succubus, demons who visited the sleeping to do all manner of unspeakable things, mostly sexual, occasionally bureaucratic. The term nightmare itself comes from the Old English mare, a malicious spirit believed to sit on a sleeper's chest, rendering them immobile. Imagine waking up unable to move, chest heavy, air thick with dread, and instead of calling it sleep paralysis and blaming your caffeine intake, everyone assumes you're being ridden by a demonic spirit. This is why people would sleep with iron under their pillows, or scatter salt in a circle around the bed. Salt, as it turns out, was the Swiss army knife of superstition, good for seasoning, preserving, and warding off the forces of evil. They believed demons couldn't cross a salt circle, much like slugs or particularly conscientious burglars. Sleepwalking, talking in your sleep, or even dreaming about flying could land you in trouble. These were signs that you might be dabbling with witchcraft, or worse, consorting with demons in your dreams. One poor monk reported levitating during a nightmare, and was promptly exorcised, just in case. Not the fun kind with spinning heads, but the Latin-chanting, candle-waving kind. Animals, especially cats, were also suspected of aiding night demons. Black cats were thought to be witches' familiars, supernatural helpers who might transform into demons at night and go joyriding on your roof. Owls hooting after dark? Definitely a sign that something unholy was afoot. Probably your cat, if it wasn't currently being burned at the stake. Let's talk protection. Amulets and charms were big business. There were talismans made from wolf teeth, prayer scrolls tucked into clothing, and even jars of dried frogs. Because why not? Some people kept a piece of iron under the mattress, while others preferred to hang a severed weasel paw near the bed for good luck and maximum creep factor. The church, ever resourceful, provided a menu of prayers and rituals specifically designed to ward off demonic harassment. These ranged from the simple, crossing yourself and muttering a psalm, to the more elaborate, like fasting, flagellation, or taking a pilgrimage to the nearest cathedral with a large stash of holy relics. Nothing says spiritual wellness like walking 40 miles barefoot to kiss a shin bone in a glass box. And if you really wanted to avoid a demonic encounter, don't sleep alone. That's right. Shared beds weren't just a matter of economy, they were a medieval safety net. The idea was that demons were less likely to attack if someone else was nearby. Unless, of course, your bedmate was already possessed, in which case, good luck. Speaking of possession, this was the medieval equivalent of going viral. If someone started speaking in tongues, convulsing, or developing a sudden aversion to holy water, it was assumed that a demon had moved in like a terrible roommate. Exorcisms were theatrical affairs involving priests, candles, and lots of shouting. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes the possessed just got louder. Either way, it gave everyone something to talk about between plagues. Communities treated possessed individuals with a mixture of horror, fascination, and just a pinch of envy if the afflicted person got to miss chores. In rare cases, people faked possession for attention, which honestly says a lot about medieval entertainment options. But it wasn't all fire and brimstone. Some folk beliefs provided surprisingly wholesome remedies. Drinking valerian root tea, for example, was thought to calm the soul and help fend off bad dreams. Children were given protective charms like hagstones, rocks with holes through them, to hang around their necks. And mothers told their children to sleep facing east toward the Holy Land, because apparently even demons respected cartography. Ultimately, the medieval relationship with the supernatural was a complicated mix of fear, faith, and practical paranoia. People wanted to believe they were protected, even if that meant sleeping with garlic under their pillow and a dagger under their mattress. Better safe than supernaturally sorry. Even kings weren't immune. Royal courts employed astrologers, exorcists, and the occasional alchemist, just in case someone forgot to bless the royal chamber pot. Nobility might commission protective talismans encrusted with gems, because if you're going to fight the forces of evil, you may as well do it in style. As ridiculous as many of these beliefs seem today, they served an important psychological function. In a world with high infant mortality, rampant disease, and a suspicious lack of night lights, having some explanation, even a supernatural one, offered a sense of control. If you knew the rules, maybe you could survive the night. So tonight, when you tuck yourself in, be thankful for modern science, central heating, and the knowledge that the shadow in the corner is probably just your bathrobe. Probably. Now go throw some salt over your shoulder, just in case. Speaking of possession, this was the medieval equivalent of going viral. If someone started speaking in tongues, convulsing, or developing a sudden aversion to holy water, it was assumed that a demon had moved in like a terrible roommate. Exorcisms were theatrical affairs involving priests, candles, and lots of shouting. Sometimes they worked. Sometimes the possessed just got louder. Either way, it gave everyone something to talk about between plagues. Communities treated possessed individuals with a mixture of horror, fascination, and just a pinch of envy if the afflicted person got to miss chores. In rare cases, people faked possession for attention, which honestly says a lot about medieval entertainment options. But it wasn't all fire and brimstone. Some folk beliefs provided surprisingly wholesome remedies. Drinking valerian root tea, for example, was thought to calm the soul and help fend off bad dreams. Children were given protective charms like hagstones, rocks with holes through them, to hang around their necks. And mothers told their children to sleep facing east toward the Holy Land, because apparently even demons respected cartography. Ultimately, the medieval relationship with the supernatural was a complicated mix of fear, faith, and practical paranoia. People wanted to believe they were protected, even if that meant sleeping with garlic under their pillow and a dagger under their mattress. Better safe than supernaturally sorry. Even kings weren't immune. Royal courts employed astrologers, exorcists, and the occasional alchemist, just in case someone forgot to bless the royal chamber pot. Nobility might commission protective talismans encrusted with gems, because if you're going to fight the forces of evil, you may as well do it in style. As ridiculous as many of these beliefs seem today, they served an important psychological function. In a world with high infant mortality, rampant disease, and a suspicious lack of night lights, having some explanation, even a supernatural one, offered a sense of control. If you knew the rules, maybe you could survive the night. So tonight, when you tuck yourself in, be thankful for modern science, central heating, and the knowledge that the shadow in the corner is probably just your bathrobe. Probably. Now go throw some salt over your shoulder, just in case. The Church, of course, maintained control over the canonization process. It was the medieval version of quality control. Otherwise, every village would have a local miracle worker claiming sainthood because he once sneezed and cured a chicken. For the average medieval person, going on a pilgrimage was both a spiritual obligation and a personal quest. Whether to seek healing, fulfill a vow, or escape taxes for a while, thousands set off each year with little more than a walking stick, a small bag of beurre, and boundless optimism. Destinations varied. Some were local, maybe a nearby shrine or healing spring. Others were epic, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Canterbury in England, Rome, or the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. The farther you traveled, the more points you earned in heaven's frequent walker program. The journey itself was grueling, roads were bad, food was worse, and inns were the medieval equivalent of Yelp one-star nightmares. Bandits, disease, and wildly unpredictable weather added spice to the holy endeavor. Pilgrims often traveled in groups for safety, though nothing tested one's faith like sharing a flea-infested blanket with 3 snoring strangers. To mark their journey, pilgrims collected badges, little metal tokens from each shrine or site. These were the original souvenir magnets, proudly displayed on hats or cloaks. They said, "Yes, I walked 600 miles, and all I got was divine grace and this tin badge." Some pilgrims wore specific attire, long robes, wide-brimmed hats, and, if heading to Santiago, the iconic scallop shell. This wasn't just fashion, it was branding. You wanted people to know you were holy, not just homeless. There was also a social dimension. Pilgrimages offered rare opportunities to meet people from other regions. Think of it as a medieval networking event, minus the hors d'oeuvres. Songs, tales, and spiritual gossip traveled along these roads. You could learn which saints were trending and which miracles were hot this season. Of course, not all pilgrims were paragons of piety. Some went for adventure, others for the chance to skip town. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales perfectly captures this mix. Bawdy, noble, and everything in between. Drunken brawls at hostels, stolen relics, and romantic escapades were not uncommon. Just because you're on the road to salvation doesn't mean you can't stop at the tavern. Some even faked pilgrimages. They'd claim to be traveling, collect donations or free meals, then head home once their pockets were full. Others sold fake badges or relics to the gullible. This, good sir, is a genuine toenail of St. Bartholomew. Note the divine grime. Yet despite the scams, people kept walking. They wanted healing, forgiveness, or just a glimpse of something bigger than themselves. A medieval pilgrimage was part therapy, part penance, and part spectacle, with just a dash of cardio. Shrines were pilgrimage destinations, and the competition to host one was fierce. A good shrine could put a village on the map, boost the local economy, and bring in so many travelers that the local outhouse situation became critical. These shrines ranged from grand cathedrals to modest roadside chapels. What mattered was the relic and the story behind it. The shrine of St. Cuthbert in Durham, for instance, drew crowds for its saint's uncorrupted body. Rumors said he looked as fresh as the day he died, assuming you liked your saints with a side of waxiness. Miracle accounts were proudly displayed, sometimes painted on walls. Blind man healed after touching this rock. Woman cured of boils thanks to St. Ethelbert's elbow. Testimonials were the medieval Yelp. Merchandising was robust. Candles, icons, and bits of fabric supposedly rubbed on the saint's tomb were sold to pilgrims hoping to bring the magic home. Local vendors sold snacks and souvenirs. Medieval capitalism was alive and well, just wearing a halo. Pilgrimages were often tied to indulgences, a way to reduce your time in purgatory by collecting spiritual bonus points. The church kept score. Visiting a particular shrine could knock years off your afterlife waiting period. Visit during a holy year. Double points. This was especially appealing to people who had sinned creatively and were looking for a loophole. Yes, I may have stabbed my neighbor, but I walked to Rome barefoot in February, so we're good, right? Some even paid others to make the trip for them. This gave rise to professional pilgrims, people who traveled on behalf of wealthy patrons too lazy, busy, or dead to go themselves. It's the medieval equivalent of outsourcing your cardio and karma. Many believed pilgrimages could be dangerous, not just physically but spiritually. There were stories of demons trying to dissuade travelers, strange visions along the road, and mysterious figures offering suspicious guidance. Basically, medieval pilgrimages doubled as horror movies with worse lighting. Some pilgrims reported miracles, sudden healings, visions of saints, divine voices guiding their steps. Others experienced the opposite: plagues, accidents, or encounters with the devil disguised as a sheep. The road was unpredictable, but that was part of the thrill. In the end, returning home from a pilgrimage was a badge of honor. You'd regale neighbors with tales of danger and devotion, flash your badges like a spiritual Boy Scout, and quietly hope that your soul had, in fact, been upgraded. Though modern people may no longer walk for weeks to see a thumb bone, pilgrimages persist in spirit. Today's versions involve retreats, sacred walks, or visits to inspirational places. The goal remains the same: to step outside the ordinary, to seek meaning, and to maybe buy a questionable souvenir. The medieval obsession with saints, relics, and holy journeys speaks to a deep human desire for connection with the divine. with history, and with one another. It's touching, really, how people in woolen socks and zero SPF risked everything to touch a dusty skull and say, "I was here, I believed." So next time you grumble about airport security, imagine walking barefoot for 500 miles, only to sleep in a hayloft and eat moldy bread while clutching a toenail. Suddenly that delayed flight doesn't seem so bad, does it?